welcome everyone into another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Monday, June 10th, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking about Florida State and Clemson and the ACC, give you guys a little bit of an update there because it's coming up time where Florida State and Clemson are going to have to make a decision, not for this year, but for 2025 if they want to be in the conference. So I want to break that down for you guys and how Florida State is looking in some very interesting directions to possibly get the money they need to get out of the conference. Then we're going to get into Texas. They went a little viral this weekend for a display they put on during the recruiting visit. I want to break down my feelings on this and how I don't necessarily love it, but I suppose the game is the game at this point. Then we'll get into some win totals out of the SEC, a lot of SEC content today. We'll get to some win totals. I'll say who's too high, who's too low, who's absolutely on the money with their prediction this season. And then we'll get into Cinderella Watch for the SEC. I have two teams today. I'm going to go through the conferences throughout the week. But today we're going to do the SEC, and I have two teams that I think could make some more noise than people might be expecting. And then we have a new segment for you all today. We're going to do Monday questions likely throughout from now until the season starts, and kind of just break down different questions that you guys have for the upcoming season. Now, I did 3 myself today, but would love to get some more interaction with the fan base, so absolutely submit any questions you have for that. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always fun for the both of us. But definitely use that if you would like, gsmcpodcast.net. I can also see comments on the side here, so if you want to just comment something, that's more than fine as well. But let's jump right in and let's talk about Florida State and Clemson, because it's been a little bit quiet around the Florida State-Clemson ACC battle that has been going on for quite some time now. Let's be totally honest. It feels like it's been an eternity. It really has only been about 7-8 months, but it felt like it's been much, much longer than that. But Florida State and Clemson are still battling it out with the ACC. I believe there's 5 different lawsuits out there. The 2 initial ones from Florida State and Clemson, ACC countersuing them, and then there's one more from Florida State that was thrown out there to kind of go at the TV deal from ESPN, saying that it wasn't ironclad and they could get out of it because they signed it with the ACC, not with Florida State. So that's kind of an added layer to this. But one of the big things about this that I think is picking up more and more steam as we get further and further into these conversations is, where are these teams going to go? And it seems like the SEC, at least as of right now, does not seem very interested in either of these entities. And I think that might hurt Clemson more than it hurts Florida State, and I'll get into that a little bit later on in the segment. But it does leave a big-time question, right? You're fighting so hard to get out of the ACC, and you want to do it probably as soon as possible. But if you don't necessarily have a landing spot, which is something that some schools in the past haven't had. I think Utah is the best example of this, where they were out of the Pac-12 and they kind of just needed somewhere to go. They weren't going to be one of the teams that was left behind, so they wanted to, hitch their wagon somewhere, and it was the Big 12, and now you can see that's not necessarily where they wanted to be. And they're trying to find their way over to the ACC, which is something that we'll obviously touch on more and more as more stuff comes out from that. But the reality is, this is a very messy situation, and Florida State and Clemson have been pushing for this for quite some time, but the question now becomes, is the grass greener on the other side? And also, can you handle what is coming on the other side? Because there's this very interesting dynamic that has formed around Florida State and Clemson, and it's not to say anything, disparaging towards Florida State and Clemson by any means, but when you talk about where they would stack up in these other conferences in terms of, athletic budget and money and all of that type of thing that seems to be the thing that most people care about in these conversations, Florida State and Clemson currently are number 1 and number 2 in the ACC in terms of athletic budget. Florida State would be 9 in the SEC, Clemson would be 11. So that's a gap. There's no two ways about that. That is going to cause problems for them, not only getting into the league, but once they get there, how they're going to deal with that is going to be a whole nother conversation. So there's a lot of stuff that's going to go into this, and there's a lot of questions from the Florida State and Clemson side of where do they fit in these conversations with the Big Ten or with the SEC, and how do they kind of make their way out of the ACC, not only just out of it, but into another conference where they're in a better situation? Because there is a reality out there that I think some Florida State and Clemson fans, you likely don't have to worry about it too much, but I do think there is a reality where both these teams find their way out of the conference, and then they find their way into the Big 12. And it makes the Big 12 a little bit better, maybe hurts the ACC a little bit, but you're kind of in the same situation you were a second ago. So that's going to be a very interesting thing to watch. I think that both these teams will find a home somewhere. It's just, as of right now, it doesn't seem like too many people are, really chomping at the bit to get these two teams, I guess. And I think the SEC and the Big Ten are the two ones to watch. And Big Ten, I haven't necessarily heard anything definitive from. I think if Florida State would be the team that I would more lean towards the Big Ten, because of some research dollars they have behind their university and some different things that just make them a little bit, would help them a little bit, I suppose, in those Big Ten conversations. Clemson doesn't necessarily have the same thing. And I think that's the team that, frankly, I'm worried about more in these conversations and going forward after they leave the ACC, because I think we all feel that that's going to happen. Now, Florida State is one of the teams that have tried to figure out some of the financial issues that they're kind of dealing with. And it's not necessarily that they're dealing with big-time financial issues over there, but there is, a hierarchy in the sport, and it's becoming more and more clear every single day, and Florida State is currently on the wrong side of that. And there's a couple of different ways they've thought about going about it, but they're the team that has been kicking around private equity probably more than any other major team in college football, at least to my knowledge, that has been reported. I mean, they've been linked to JP Morgan Chase. They've been linked to Sixth Street, Weatherford Capital, which is one of their former players, Drew Weatherford. He was a quarterback for Florida State. He now runs that. So could be a very interesting conversation. CBS apparently reached out to him. I believe it was Dennis Dodd that did this piece, and he declined to comment on the situation. It could mean that they're, fully in talks and trying to figure out what that number is going to look like. It could be that things have cooled off. You never really know. It seems like a lot of people have different ideas of what private equity is going to mean in college football going forward. From where I'm standing, I am finding it to be a thing that's going to be really hard to avoid, I suppose. I think the best way to put it would be everyone's, in this arms race, right? Everyone wants, the best team. They want the most money. They want the best TV deal. They want everything in between. And that's all well and good, but you need money to do that. And from where I'm sitting, at least over the last couple of years, it doesn't seem like anything would hold them back from trying to get that money to compete at the highest level in football. So if that's private equity, it's private equity. And Florida State seems like a team that has really been kicking that around. And there's been a ton of different ideas of what their budget could look like going forward. I believe their AD, Michael Alford, said it would be about 20 different athletic budgets that they've fleshed out for the future up until like 2043. So a lot of programs, or a lot of athletic departments around the country, are doing this, trying to get their ducks in a row, trying to figure out what the future looks like. And it feels like Florida State is taking maybe the most aggressive approach in terms of, going into private equity, saying we'll take the huge influx of cash, and whatever happens after that is a big time question, because I don't necessarily trust this as much as some other people do. Greg Sankey has said it probably won't be that big of a deal because, as he so eloquently put it, these people want their money back. And that's definitely something that just is the case with private equity. That's what they do. They try to make money for their clients, for their company, and it can create problems when you have a landscape like college football right now that is wide open. And usually when things are wide open and it's kind of like the Wild West, there's a big time chance to make some money. And some people use that to exploit the sport. Some people use it to help the sport. And we'll figure out which is which at some point down the road. But I'd be very worried about private equity getting in on these conversations. I understand that Florida State is trying to bridge the gap, and they're trying to become more of a SEC program, more of a Big Ten program before they even get there. I fully understand the pressures that they're under, but I think they'll find if they do sign these contracts, if they do go through with private equity, in about 5 years, they're going to be maybe regretting that decision because some bills are going to become due from those private equity firms, and it's not necessarily going to be the situation that you want it to be. Now, it does help a little bit that one of the firms is run by a former quarterback of their team. I won't lie to you about that, but it is a very interesting conversation. And I don't know what Florida State and Clemson are looking to do in the future. I don't know where they land in the future. It feels like for both these teams, frankly, the SEC would be the quote-unquote cultural fit. I said before that Florida State fits a little bit more in the Big Ten in some respects with some research dollars and the some different things that they have at their disposal that some SEC teams just don't find quite as important. At least the SEC, when accepting new members, they don't find that quite as important. So we'll see, I guess is the best way to put it. But some decisions do need to be made fairly quickly. I think it's somewhere in August 25th, something like that. They do have to make a decision about where they want to be in 2025. And is it the ACC? Is it somewhere else? And I don't know if they can make that decision if they don't know where they're going to end up. So it's going to be a fascinating conversation. They have the ACC media deal has a look-in clause in February of 2025 that if Florida State and Clemson make it known that they want out of the conference before the 25 season, there's going to be some hard conversations had about possibly renegotiating deal, possibly bringing down the annual amount for that ESPN deal year over year. So it'll be fascinating to watch. Florida State and Clemson are in a really weird spot because it feels like they have a certain amount of power in being on the offensive and being the team that is trying to get out in front of this and trying to get out of their conference and being the powerhouse, college football programs at least that they are. It definitely does help them, but also you're not necessarily the biggest prize in the ACC. As we've gone over before, I think North Carolina and Duke outweigh them by a little bit because of that basketball rivalry, because of that energy, and that's why the SEC looked at trying to get Duke into the SEC as a basketball program. So it'll be fascinating to watch all of this unfold. I think Florida State and Clemson are definitely having some really hard conversations right now. Do we want to pull the trigger on this right now? Do we want to wait until, a little bit down the road and figure out where we are, get our ducks in a row, and maybe have an invitation before we leave? I really don't know what the best way forward is for these two programs, but I know that we'll get some decisions pretty soon about where they're going to be in 2025 and how they're going to kind of go about maybe bridging the gap to get to another conference. So it'll be fascinating to watch. I think Florida State and Clemson have dominated a lot of the conversation over this offseason with these cases and everything. It feels like some of this stuff is starting to come to a head at the very least and starting to get some more answers around what's going to happen. But we'll obviously keep an eye on that. Definitely some more stuff to happen there. And if they're in the ACC in 2025, it's some very, very interesting conversations, that's for sure. But let's move on here. Let's take our first break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about Texas. They went a little bit viral this weekend for a interesting recruiting tactic, I'll put it that way, that they employed this weekend for a big-time recruiting visit they had. And I'll get into my thoughts about it. Definitely a lot of people had some thoughts, but I'll give my 2 cents right after this, so stick with us.